Hello, everyone. I'm going to be sharing with you some information from Eric Jensen's Teaching with Poverty in Mind: What Being Poor Does to Kids' Brains and What Schools Can Do About It. As the title suggests, this book focuses on how teachers and schools can help students be highly successful despite having a low socioeconomic status. Eric Jensen packs this book full of research that supports the following three claims that guide the entire book. 1. Chronic exposure to poverty causes the brain to be physically affected in negative ways. But 2. The brain can also change for the better, and children of low socioeconomic status can experience success in academics. And 3. There are some key factors that schools and teachers need to do in order to produce these favorable outcomes for their children. So, what I'd like to do is go through with you the 6 chapters of this book and point out some of the things that I found to be the central focus, the most compelling, or even just the most interesting to myself. The first chapter focuses on answering the question, what is poverty and what does it look like? Poverty can be defined in many terms. There's the definition determined by the Office of Management and Budget, which characterizes being poor as having an income less than that deemed sufficient to purchase basic needs such as food, shelter, clothing, and other essentials. Eric Jensen also gives us his own definition of poverty as a chronic and debilitating condition that results from multiple adverse synergistic risk factors and affects the mind, body, and soul. The book recognizes that poverty will mean different things to different people, and it also recognizes 6 different types of poverty may exist. Situational poverty, resulting from a sudden loss or crisis. Generational, where 2 or more generations are born into poverty. Absolute poverty, where there is an extreme scarcity of food and shelter. Relative poverty, where income does not meet society's average. Urban poverty, where overcrowding and violence can be chronic stressors. And rural poverty, with less access to support for disabilities and quality education programs. This chapter goes on to take a close look at what the nature of poverty looks like and what families and children of low socioeconomic status experience. A quick summary is that these families have a higher likelihood to have a single guardian household, which can strain resources. Families are more likely to experience depression and chemical dependency. And they are less likely to have adequate daycare and tend to have fewer books and spend more time watching TV. The second chapter of this book is all about what poverty does to the brain, or essentially, what are the risk factors for poor students. Jensen provides the mnemonic device, EACH, for the 4 risk factors that he has identified: emotional and social challenges, acute and chronic stressors, cognitive lags, and health and safety issues. Jumping into the E of the acronym, the emotional and social challenges children of poverty experience. Extensive research has identified what children need in the early stages of their life in order to grow up emotionally healthy. One important vocabulary item would be attunement, which is essentially the sharing of emotions. Jensen characterizes it as 10 to 20 hours of harmonious, reciprocal interactions. While not mentioned explicitly by Jensen, this has clear connections to what we have discussed about Erikson's theory in trust versus mistrust stage of development. The reason that this attunement period is so crucial to healthy social emotional development is because the brain is only hardwired for 6 emotions. Every other emotion that is critical for success must be taught. Jensen creates the metaphor that children who come from poverty may only be capable of playing a few notes on their emotional keyboard. Students may be more likely to display what teachers might call acting out behaviors, so it's important to try to remember that they might not be equipped to act any differently, and it's up to teachers to teach appropriate responses. Moving on, the next challenges facing poor students are acute and chronic stressors. This book really is jam-packed with information on stress, but some of the most compelling research is the neurobiological studies that show how the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are some of the areas of the brain most affected by the stress hormone cortisol. Research on neglected and abused children provide evidence that stress shrinks neurons in the brain's frontal lobes. This is critical to academic success because these areas of the brain are closely associated with learning and working memory. But what I found to be really interesting was that other evidence has found that stress causes the opposite to occur in the amygdala, which is deemed the emotional center of the brain. Chronic stress was found to increase neuron complexity in the amygdala. These two facts can have a combining effect in kids who experience chronic stress. They have an emotional memory, which is heightened, memories of trauma or neglect, and a reduced declarative memory, memories associated with knowledge and learning. Moving on to the C of our acronym is cognitive legs. This part of the chapter gives by far the deepest look into how brains really are affected by poverty. It takes a look at a lot of the research done with low socioeconomic students and cognitive ability. Unfortunately, this research finds that there is a big gap between poor students and well-off students when it comes to almost every measure of cognitive ability. But it is in this section of the book that readers get introduced to the idea of thinking of the brain as an operating system. I really like thinking about it in this matter because it really gets to the point across that brains can change. Just like we update the operating systems on our phones, students' operating systems can change too. Of the different cognitive functions, language acquisition has the greatest difference between poor and well-off students. Lastly, in our EACH acronym is H, health effects. The research shows that children who come from poverty are subject to higher health risks than well-off children. Housing in low-income neighborhoods has more hazards like poor air quality, radon, and carbon monoxide, and can produce many adverse health effects such as asthma or respiratory infections. And poor parents are also more likely to have premature children or children born with disabilities due to hazardous working conditions of mothers who are living in poverty. While Chapter 2 painted a grim picture, Chapter 3 is a little bit more optimistic and looks at how the brain actually can change. It examines neuroplasticity and gene expression. I think that it's an important time to define these two terms. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to form neural connections throughout a person's life. I've already been mentioning this, that brains can change. But now, here in Chapter 3, we also get to talk about gene expression. The book defines gene expression as the translation of information encoded in a gene into protein or RNA. Essentially, genes can be expressed or non-expressed. Coming from a biology background myself, the section on gene expression was one of the most interesting parts of the book for me. The book talks about behavioral geneticist Robert Plomlin, whose studies have found that the same genes that were correlated with reading difficulties were also correlated with math difficulties. So this suggests that the likelihood of generalist genes that can serve multiple learning functions. There's a lot more research that needs to be done, but these generalist genes really could be a game changer for teachers who are setting out to help their students upgrade their operating systems. If there's one chapter that really sets out to prove the point that brains can change, it's Chapter 3. There isn't enough time in this presentation to go through all of the research that Eric Jensen lays out, but he does a great job including over 35 different studies in this chapter, many having to do with IQ and some other cognitive abilities, and really proves that our brains are dynamic and they can change. In chapters 4 and 5, the book examines the schools that are making it happen. Again, we create another mnemonic device to help us remember what the top schools do. Here we have SHARE, which stands for Support the Whole Child, Hard Data, Accountability, Relationship Building, and Enrichment Mindset. Let's take a look at how the Prus School in La Jolla, California, a public charter school with 670 students with 100% eligibility for free and reduced lunch, can have a graduation rate of 100% and send 95% of students off to four-year colleges. Let's see how they support the whole student. They have a healthcare partnership with the University of California, San Diego. They have tutoring in every subject by qualified university tutors. They have resource specialists for creating individual education plans. They have a private psychologist available for no-cost therapy for students, as well as a district psychologist for on-site testing and counseling, and on-campus internships for students. High-quality schools must be able to also create their own assessments to collect data. Let's take a look at Sandpit Elementary in rural South Carolina, where 90% of the students receive free or reduced price lunch. They have gone from being below average to having 85% of their students achieving basic ratings in English and math. They've done this by studying their own ongoing assessments, and they have meetings with peers where they can study those and identify student needs and plan interventions. Accountability. Teachers have to buy in because when working with students from a poverty background, there is no room for error. It's kind of like from Love Them First when Principal Friesleben says, if they were any other kids, they'd be fine, but our kids need the absolute best. Teachers must be engaged every minute of class. In El Paso, Texas, the university revamped the way that they prepared teachers, and ever since then, the city of El Paso has begun to close the gaps. Relationships. In Belle Chase Primary School in Belle Chase, Louisiana, nearly 3/4 of students are eligible for free and reduced lunch, but their fourth graders have the third highest math scores and the sixth highest English language arts scores in the state. The secret here, teachers know every single kid's name and send weekly notes home to parents. School leaders support the staff and staff support the kids. Students want to do better because the staff cares that much. Enrichment. At Esperanza Elementary in San Antonio, Texas, Principal Melva acknowledges to parents and staffs that students lack many benefits of middle-class upbringings, which is why they have the attitude, because our students have less, we must provide more. The school provides many enriching activities like field trips and after-schools enrichment activities like guitar, journalism, and technology. I'm really glad that I chose to read this book for my presentation, and I would recommend this book to anybody who's going to be going into a classroom. I haven't talked yet about Chapter 6 of this book, but Chapter 6 is a little bit different. So far in each chapter, Eric Jensen at the beginning of each chapter writes a little paragraph about this character, Mr. Hawkins. And Mr. Hawkins is a teacher who, at the beginning, doesn't understand why his kids are acting out, and he chalks it up to being disrespectful and maybe lazy. That's why they don't want to do their work. But by the last chapter, Mr. Hawkins is buying into the idea that he can help these students. And so the last chapter is all about Mr. Hawkins, and it goes through his daily schedule and what he does in order to provide a positive impact for his students. And that part of the book was actually most inspiring to read. Like I could kind of put myself in this character's shoes, and pretend that, this is how I could teach my classroom, and this is how I could make sure that I am doing everything I can for students who are facing poverty. There's nothing in this book that I couldn't really disagree with, or anything that I couldn't see myself wanting to implement in my own classroom even. It's definitely not this is everything that you have to do kind of book. It's just really emphasizes like the most important things to know about working with students from a low socioeconomic status. And I will say, as it's read, it is really jam-packed with a lot of research. So it'd also be good if you are doing some kind of research project on students in poverty. But even so, at the end of each chapter, he gives his own little tips, and he fills the book with a lot of advice along the way, which I think is really good. So yeah, again, I recommend this book. If you guys at all have time, give it a chance. And even just reading that last chapter that I said was pretty inspiring. I think that would be a good read. You could even start the book there, I think, at chapter 6 and then go back. All right, I'm at 14 and a half minutes, so thank you guys very much for listening.